Scott Gehlbach. It's really a great pleasure to have him here. Scott is the Elise and Jack Lipsey Professor at the University of Chicago. And he is a real triple threat in that he is highly skilled and very well published in formal theory, including his book, Formal Models of Domestic Politics. He's an expert in Russian politics with deep experience, not only analyzing the contemporary period, but also historical periods. And he's also an expert in political economy and is currently the president of the Society for Institutional and Organizational Economics. And he's going to talk about some of his work today in historical political economy, in which he is really one of the leading practitioners and has really done a great deal to shape this emerging field. So today's session is, we're going to try to replicate as much as we can a seminar-like setting. This is a webinar, so if you do have a question, raise your hand and or send a chat message to Anton Shirikov. And then he can unmute you, and then you can ask the question. Scott prefers interruptions, as we commonly do in a seminar setting. So in order to facilitate that, we have to go through this somewhat convoluted mechanism. But so if you do have a question, raise hand, Anton will unmute you, and then you can ask the question directly to Scott. With those technicalities out of the way, I'll leave the floor open to Scott Gehlbach. So please join me in welcoming Scott.
Okay, thanks so much, Tim. And it's really nice to be back on the Columbia campus, so to speak, as I join you from my hotel room. Feels a little bit like COVID and a little bit not. But it's a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to present some of this work. Let me just say one thing before I get started. So Tim mentioned the field of historical political economy and its growth, especially among those who study Russia, Ukraine, former Soviet Union, Imperial Russia, that part of the world. For those of you who are maybe graduate students thinking about getting involved in the field, you should know that we run an annual workshop. It's called the Summer Workshop in the Economic History and Historical Political Economy of Eurasia, that brings together political scientists, economists, and historians in roughly equal measure who work on Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. We're not running it this summer because of the CO meetings, the Society for Institutional and Organizational Economics meetings that I'm running this summer in Chicago, but we'll be back in business next year. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Does everybody see that? Tim, do you see that?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So then let me get started. And let me do so by introducing my co-authors. So Paul Dower is my former colleague at Wisconsin. He's about 50% development economics and 50% economic history, with work primarily, though not exclusively, in the part of the world that we're focused on today. Dima Kafanov is a Wisconsin graduate in political science, now a postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh. Steve Nafziger is one of the big names in the economic history of Russia. He's at Williams College. And Vladimir Novikov is a master's student at Chicago, joining the Stanford PhD program in political science in the fall. Okay, so this is a paper about local backlash to political reform. So to put this into general context, what we're interested in this paper is what happens when there is, at typically the national level, some major political change or reform. It could be a revolution, it could be a new constitution, it could be a watershed election. The sort of momentous event that generates not only winners, but also losers. And among those losers, quite often feelings of political threat. So individuals who have, in some relative sense at least, lost political power that they had under the status quo. So these feelings of political threat can interact with pre-existing prejudices to produce a reactionary backlash, often violent backlash to political reform that plays out at the local level, where the victims of that backlash are often ethnic and religious groups that are associated with reform, though typically not directly involved in the reform process itself. So by way of example, you might think of the KKK terror during Reconstruction after the American Civil War, reprisals during and after the Irish War of Independence, the anti-Armenian pogrom in Baku in 1990 during the era of Gorbachev's reforms, and the anti-Chinese riots in 1998 in Indonesia as Suharto was in the process of losing political power. So this violence then substantially occurs at the local level. So our question is, in this general context, which communities are most vulnerable to this sort of backlash? And there's a substantial literature in economics and political science and history that might lead us to expect one answer to this question or another, typically related to the ethno-religious makeup of the communities that are potentially subject to this sort of backlash. So in the economics literature, for example, there's the idea that conflict intensity might be greater when you have two groups, say two ethnic or two religious groups of approximately equal size. That is to say, when society is especially polarized. So when two groups are of approximately equal size, neither one of them would be the obvious victor in any conflict, and the incentives to fight are going to be larger than when one group or the other is the overwhelming majority. And so here we can think especially of the theoretical work of Esteban-Ray, some empirical work by Montalvo and Reynal Corral that make this point. A related point, though, and this is a point that Esteban and Ray also make, is that if we expect the intensity of conflict to be greater when society is polarized, we might expect conflict initiation to be less likely in precisely that circumstance. So precisely because conflict is expected to be intense, those with the ability to initiate conflict or not may be more cautious about doing so, understanding the consequences of starting a conflict once it's taken off. So that's, these are theoretical perspectives in the economics and to some extent in the political science literature. There are related assertions that one sees in historical accounts of ethno-religious conflict, especially where the argument seems maybe superficially more naive. It's just the suggestion that there's some monotonic relationship. So the larger or the smaller some group is, then the more likely would be conflict. And I'll present various examples below from our historical setting of assertions like this that have been made by historians over the years. So there's a little bit of related econometric work that also suggests a more monotonic relationship between the size of some group and the likelihood of conflict, emphasizing, say, the visibility of some targeted group, which is presumably greater when that group is relatively large, the greater likelihood that members of some group will engage in occupations that might provoke resentment or grievances when that group is relatively large, the electoral utility or the electoral threat that a group poses when it's relatively large. So, again, in contrast to the work on polarization, these are all arguments about that conflict would be larger or smaller when some group is especially large or especially small.
Scott, I have a question.
Please.
This is Tim.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
So maybe you're going to get to this, but these theories are general, not limited to cases of the introduction of political reform.
Indeed.
That's correct?
That's correct. And so as you were talking, I just flip forward to the very bottom of the slide. None of this work explicitly examines conflict following reform. Yeah, so that's exactly right. So if we want to think about backlash to reform, maybe this work leads us astray a little bit. Okay, and so where we're going with this is that we do need to think about conflict that follows reform differently, but as we'll see, we can in fact do so in using existing theoretical frameworks, which when properly understood, suggest relationships like those that we observe in the data.
Sorry to not anticipate your next sentence. So
no, right on cue. So thank you. Yeah, okay.
It was not rehearsed.
Yeah. Okay. So what do we do in this paper? So we explore the heterogeneous effect of political reform on reactionary violence, which in our context means anti-Jewish pogroms during the 1905 Russian Revolution. So this is I'll present my potted history of the Russian Revolution in a few slides, but in brief, it's a period of political upheaval that follows the Russo-Japanese War. This is a political unrest that occurs in a context of widespread anti-Semitism and identification of Jews with the revolutionary movements of the day, leading ultimately to hundreds of anti-Jewish pogroms over the course of 1904-1905. So we're going to exploit, in particular, the shock of the October 1905 Manifesto. So this is the Tsar's concession to unrest, his attempt to bring unrest under control, the promise of a parliament that would be popularly elected and have some political power, the guarantee of political and civil liberties, in general, the end of the absolute monarchy that had governed Russia for centuries. And this led in short order to a backlash by rightists, monarchists, some of the very same workers who had been on strike just a few weeks before, and a large spike in pogroms in November 1905. So in the weeks immediately following the publication of the October Manifesto. And so what we're going to do in this paper is examine the change in pogrom incidents and settlements with varying shares of Jews and non-Jews using a geocoded sample of nearly 1,400 Jewish settlements in the Pale of Settlement. So this is the part of Western Imperial Russia, the region in which residence of Jews is generally confined during this period. And we're going to additionally use data that we have digitized for this project on religious composition at the settlement level from the 1897 Russian census. Okay, and so this slide illustrates both our design and our main results, and you can almost leave just immediately after this slide unless you're interested in the theoretical takeaway, in which case you're going to have to wait until the end of the talk. What do we find? So the two figures, what do we do and what do we find? So the two figures in this slide illustrate the evolution of pogroms over the period that we examined, 1904 into 1906, in Jewish communities with, in the left figure, relatively low and relatively high polarization, where polarization here is defined as the share of Jews times the share of non-Jews in the settlement. And in the right figure, in communities with relatively low and relatively high Jewish share. Okay, and so what we see is that there's a large spike, as we know, in anti-Jewish pogroms in the month following the publication of the October Manifesto. But that spike is of similar magnitude in settlements with relatively low and relatively high polarization, whereas in contrast is much smaller in communities with relatively large Jewish populations than in communities with relatively small Jewish populations. So pogroms are less likely to break out after the October Manifesto relative to their incidents before in communities with relatively large Jewish populations. Okay, and so we show that this result is just incredibly robust. The association between size of the Jewish community and the increase in pogroms is not confounded by weather shocks, by anything that might be happening at the provincial level. So settlements are nested in provinces. Anything that might be happening at the provincial level that changes over time, not by observed settlement level characteristics. The correlation doesn't appear to be driven by diffusion modeled in various ways. Just, it doesn't matter what you do, and you might expect this just given what you see in the raw data. It doesn't really matter what you do econometrically, that association holds up. And so then we'll argue that, and this is the payoff, if you stay for the full 90 minutes of the talk, is we'll argue that these empirical patterns are in fact consistent with a slightly extended version of one of the key models of conflict initiation and intensity in the literature when we properly understand political reform as asymmetric, as generating a systematic shock to the status quo distribution across communities. So read properly, in other words, the existing theoretical work in the literature leads us to the right conclusion. So that's where we're going.
Scott,
Tim.
do you have a sense of what is it about the size that is affecting the result?
So we'll get to this, but in brief, when one group is relatively large, then the other group we think would have a relatively lower chance of getting what they want out of conflict. Their expected payoff from initiating conflict would therefore be lower, and they'd be less likely to initiate it.
So it's related to the probability of success.
Yeah.
John Marshall, I think, has a question.
John.
Yes, so it seems like you're largely focused on population distributions, but you're not saying very much about who has sort of local authority over the state. So is it possible that what's changing here is that Jewish people are more involved in local power institutions, which could prevent pogroms in the areas where there's higher populations?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So maybe some of this we can defer until we've had a little bit more of a discussion of the empirical context. But in general, you can think of there being maybe a lot of variation across settlements in local institutions. There might be communities in which Jews are relatively integrated into local governance and those in which they are not. Any of that we're just partialing out with the diff and diff design. The question is, once you have this shock to the systematic shock to the status quo, where wherever you started, you can think of every community, the local political economy is becoming more favorable or being perceived as being more favorable to Jews and less favorable to non-Jews following the October Manifesto. That systematic shock is perceived to be disadvantageous from the perspective of some non-Jews in these communities. And so the idea is then there may be some attempt to claw back some of the political authority that existed ex ante. and whether or not that occurs is going to depend upon whether the Jewish community is able to successfully defend itself against some violent backlash. And implicitly the idea, and explicitly in terms of the theoretical model, the idea is that ability to defend oneself against violent backlash is larger when the Jewish community is relatively sizable. And you read accounts. I'll show you the data that we're working with, but you read accounts of Jews being able to organize self-defense units or failing to do so in one settlement or another, and presumably this sort of collective action is observed by those who are deciding whether or not to try to initiate violence. Okay, so that's where we're going. So here's my potted history. So our empirical setting is the Pale of Settlement, so the part of Western Imperial Russia where Jews were allowed to live in the late imperial period. Jewish settlement in the Pale is substantially a legacy of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when many of the settlements in what became the Pale were towns that were privately owned by local Polish magnates who invited Jews to their settlements in the hope that would increase economic activity. So much of what became the Pale then became part of the Russian Empire following the partitions of Poland in the late 18th century. And then additionally in the colonization of what is today Southeast Ukraine during its subsequent conquest by Russia. So the Pale of Settlement you can think of as corresponding to today contemporary Lithuania, Belarus, and Western and Southeastern Ukraine. And so following the partitions of Poland, there's historians write of a sort of golden age in the Pale of the early 19th century, and then just a gradual immiseration of many of these communities over the course of the 19th century. So the sort of picture we have in our head of the impoverished shtetl from Fiddler on the Roof or whatever. So this is maybe a better picture of conditions in the late 19th, early 20th century than it would have been before. So this is a climate, again, of pervasive anti-Semitism. So there are residential, legal, and economic restrictions on the activities of Jewish residents of the Pale, and in particular, following the issuance of the so-called May laws that followed the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, and just a lot of anti-Semitic propaganda. So, to put this into further context, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was published in 1903, so just before the Russo-Japanese War and the Russian Revolution of 1905. Okay, and so here's a first example of the sort of assertions that historians make about the relationship between the relative size of the Jewish community and their vulnerability to conflict by members of the non-Jewish community. Robert Weinberg writes, for example, that the large number of Jews, so it's about a third of the population, and their visible presence in the commercial and industrial life of the city contributed to resentment against Odessa's Jewish community. And he's writing this in the context of what then subsequently happened in Odessa and elsewhere during the wave of pogroms. And during this period, there's a popular association of Jews with revolutionary politics. So what is socialism changes over the course of the 19th century. As we know, there's a sort of socialist populism that transforms to more Marxist form of socialism in the late 19th century. Coincident with that is greater involvement of Jews in socialist politics, the creation of the General Jewish Labor Bund in the Pale of Settlement, which we'll talk briefly about a little bit later. So from 1903 to 1905, Jews make up about a third of political arrestees during this period. And so one way of thinking about what is going on here in the minds of pogromists is, you can think of this a little bit as like what behavioral economists or psychologists call the confusion of the inverse, where the fact that the probability of being Jewish given being a revolutionary is high is then inferred to mean that the probability of being a revolutionary is high if one is Jewish. And of course, the second doesn't follow from the first, but this is a common cognitive error and maybe one that was at work here. Okay, so what happens then between 1903 and 1906? So there had not been a major wave of anti-Jewish pogroms in Russia since, not really any pogroms in Russia since the early 1880s, until April 1903, when a large pogrom breaks out in Chisinau, contemporary Chisinau in Moldova. Sort of classic blood libel pogrom took place on Easter Sunday. And it was followed later that year in Gomel, in contemporary Belarus. Shlomo Lombrosa, who's one of the major historians of Jewish life during this period, writes that at Gomel, so in Chisinau, famously, or infamously, the police were very slow to respond to the pogrom. In Gomel, they reacted more quickly. And Lombrosa writes that at Gomel, local administrators were more responsive to Jews during the pogrom, possibly because they made up half of the population. They were a larger share of the population in Gomel than they were in Chisinau. Okay, we then see frequent occurrences of pogroms from spring 1904 into 1905. This is a period during the Russo-Japanese War when there's propaganda alleging Jewish collaboration with the Japanese, that Jewish communities had financed the Japanese or whatever, various conspiracy theories. This leads to what historians call mobilization pogroms during at least the early part of this period, where pogroms break out in some settlement after there's a mobilization of the local non-Jewish population to fight in the Russo-Japanese War. In general, over this period, there's increasing political tension. This culminates in a general strike in October of 1905, and the Tsar's back is to the wall, and he understands his options as either imposing a military dictatorship or allowing some sort of constitutional reform. And so for whatever reason, and one of the reasons that historians suggest is that the Grand Duke says that he'll shoot himself if the Tsar decides to impose a military dictatorship. The Grand Duke was supposed to be his dictator. The Tsar instead decides on constitutional reform. And so the October Manifesto has the effects that we discussed as general political liberalization. This results in celebrations and increased political activity, the so-called Days of Freedom, following the publication of the October Manifesto. The Days of Freedom quickly transform into anti-Tsarist demonstrations, people carrying signs saying "Down with the Tsar," "Death to the Tsar," and so forth. And historians write that Jewish participants are very visible in these demonstrations. So this leads then to a violent backlash by supporters of the monarchy. One way of thinking about the backlash is some of the pogromists, by one historical account, were workers who had been on strike in the general strike just weeks before, and they weren't looking for the death of the Tsar. They weren't looking necessarily for constitutional reform. They were looking for a shorter work week. And what they get instead is what seems like to them as chaos. And so there is then this large spike in anti-Jewish pogroms in the weeks immediately following the October Manifesto. Mark Steinberg, who's a historian at Illinois, writes that where Jews were a large part of a city's local population, right-wing violence reached extremes. So here again is an assertion of some relationship between the size of the Jewish community and the incidence of pogroms. Okay, and the wave ends then by the middle of 1906, and that's really the end of anti-Jewish pogroms in Russia until the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War. Okay.
So Scott, the anecdotes that you're citing suggest that the historians have it wrong.
The Steinberg anecdote does. The Lombrosa anecdote, in contrast, suggests that So what he argues is more consistent. Is more consistent with what we find. Yeah. Historians kind of line up. Also, though, right? Yeah. The historians are all not. They're not lined up all on one side of this relationship. Yeah. Good. Okay. So for the empirical work in this paper, then we're going to use various types of data. So the first major data source is a list of pogroms that are geolocated and dated by month from May 1904 to the end of 1906. And so these data were originally connected by Yanai Spitzer at Hebrew University. These are from Yanai's unpublished dissertation work. So particular thanks to Yanai for sharing his data with us before his work was published. And so for those who know related work by Grossfeld and Sakhalin-Zhuravskaya on anti-Jewish pogroms in the Pale of Settlement, they look at a somewhat longer period. Spitzer's data are a bit more comprehensive for the particular period that we examine. Okay, and so Spitzer compiles his data from two major data sources. So the first is a very interesting chronicle of anti-Jewish pogroms during the 1905 Russian Revolution that was compiled by the Zionist Organization of Berlin. So the Zionist Organization of Berlin sent people to the Pale to document what had happened so that they could better direct relief aid to Jewish communities in the Pale. And so this is a typical entry in the Chronicle. They're in German, of course. So to summarize, this particular pogrom occurred in a context in which the local Jewish community remembered the pogrom that had occurred there in 1881. There were embryonic Black Hundreds or extreme right-wing organizations in the community. And the account notes the failure of the local Jewish community to create self-defense organizations in advance of the pogrom. So initially, there's calm following the October Manifesto. There's then a pogrom in a neighboring settlement, and we're going to be very interested in potential diffusion and the empirical work that we do. There's then an attack on Jewish refugees from this neighboring settlement when they arrive in this one. And then a full-scale pogrom beginning 3 days after the manifesto. The pretext was that a Jewish woman had stolen a farmer's purse. There's widespread looting, violence, arson, sort of typical collaboration by the police, by the military, by local Cossacks. Here you can read a sort of representative quote by a member of one of the participants in the pogrom, tying his participation to the revolution and to the presumed Jewish participation in the reforms. And so, as we often see, there were a number of fatalities, many wounded, lots of homes were plundered, and nearly all Jewish shops were attacked.
Scott, what constitutes a pogrom?
So what constitutes a pogrom is that for Spitzer, what constitutes a pogrom is that it appears either in this chronicle or in a second data source that I'll mention in a moment. For the members of the Zionist Organization of Berlin who did this work, what constitutes a pogrom is, I suppose they heard about it and they chose to write it up. Or in the second data source, which is a little bit more comprehensive, there was news that made it to America, and therefore it was recorded in the record. So, there's probably a bit of a fine line here, but there's some widespread violence that we see in all of these accounts. It's not just one or two local encounters, but something more widespread than that. Okay, this is the second data source. So this is the American Jewish Yearbook, published, the issue published just after the 1905 Russian Revolution. You can see the accounts here are considerably more terse. It is typically sort of just one line per incident, per event, but this is a bit more comprehensive than the account of the Zionist Organization of Berlin. And so together, the union of these constitute Spitzer's data. Okay, and so we use ultimately our regression sample constitutes a subset of Spitzer's sample because there are some very small communities that we're unable, or he was unable to geolocate, or they're so small that we don't have good population data. So the regression sample ultimately, even though we lose a number of observations, it still constitutes well over 90% of the Jewish population of the Pale. And so here you can just get a sense, looking at the evolution over time, that there are pogroms every month, basically from mid-1904.
Scott, I think John Marshall has a question.
Yeah, John, yeah.
So just going back to the context. So I'm curious, like, how much of the story here is that there are people just looking for an excuse to attack Jews versus this is a story about changing power distribution. So you kind of think of like a major reform that one group supports and might potentially benefit from. Is more just a coordinating device that it just brings people together to let's go after these people which we want to get anyway. And like some of the examples from a couple of slides ago seem to be suggesting that perhaps there was this sort of element of like, this small thing happens, let's use this as an excuse for a pogrom. So I was curious, like, whether you're going to be able to speak to that and whether that's the right way to be thinking about the context here.
Yeah. No, that's good. So I guess, at some level, the excuse was always there, and the fact that there had not been any pogroms from the early 1880s until 1904 suggests, I don't know, that's a long period of time for there not to have been any possibility of coordination, but still, I think it's fair to say that there's something focal about the October Manifesto. So we, I guess, have been thinking about that more as a systematic shock to the allocation of political power in the community, but I don't think that what we're doing is inconsistent, or what we're going to show is inconsistent with the idea that serves as a particular coordinating event. I think the question would still be why that would be more likely to facilitate coordination in communities with relatively small non-Jewish populations, or with relatively small Jewish populations, with relatively small Jewish populations. And I don't know, in a way that almost kind of runs counter, for example, to an Alsonian theory of collective action, that the fact that we're seeing a larger increase in pogroms in communities with relatively large non-Jewish communities, a purely Alsonian perspective might suggest that we would see the opposite. But let's maybe put a pin in that for a second and come back to that once we see some of the empirical work, because that's an interesting possibility.
Scott, can I just
Carlo,
really quickly add something to this?
Yeah.
I understood your introduction to be about perceived changes in the distribution of power.
Yeah.
Not actual changes in the distribution of power. And I was wondering whether that distinction is helpful here. Do you have a sense in which the actors in the pogrom were expecting or thinking that the first order effect of this constitutional reform was an increase in the power of Jews. For example, an increase in the security of their assets and the property rights.
Yeah. We're going to treat those perceptions as essentially correct once we try to offer a theoretical explanation for the empirical patterns that we observe. But I think that if we back off of that a bit and just think about the empirical setting, undoubtedly, so we have the advantage of hindsight. We know what happened with the constitutional reforms of the October Manifesto, that they ultimately proved somewhat toothless. And the Tsar rolled back a lot of the concessions that he made in October 1905. That may have been hard to anticipate at the time. The typical Pogromist was not a constitutional scholar. I think what they understood was that something had happened that all of a sudden resulted in people marching through the streets saying death to the Tsar. And that seemed like a shock to their understanding of the local balance of power. And they responded to that. Okay, so just looking at this table here, we see pogroms throughout the period that we examine, but again, this big spike in November 1905. Okay, so Spitzer also gives us data on the location of settlements that he identifies as having Jewish communities circa 1897. 1897 is the date of the first and the last real census in the Russian Empire. There had been tax censuses and so forth, but this was the first national census. So this map of the Pale of Settlement just shows, first of all, that the Jewish communities, which are the blue circles on the map, are distributed across the Pale. And second, that the pogroms, which are the red circles, happen across the Pale. They're not just clustered in one part of the Pale. Okay, so then we also bring some data to this project, some new data. So we digitized, for purposes of this project, data from the 1897 census on the religious composition of every settlement in the Pale identified by Spitzer as having a Jewish community. And so the 1897 census gives us very detailed data at the settlement level on religious composition. It tells us the number of Orthodox, the number of Protestant, the number of Catholic, the number of Jewish, and so forth, members in the local community. Interestingly, at the province level, it gives us, it breaks it out even more finely. It includes things like the number of idolaters in the province. But at the settlement level, what we observe is the number of individuals that are self-identified as a member of some religious community, so long as that constitutes at least 10% of the local population. So this is important because there are a handful of settlements that Spitzer identifies as having Jewish communities where the 1897 census just lists that it doesn't break out the number of Jews in the settlement because they're under 10% of the local population. So in our baseline empirical work, we're just going to drop those settlements, but we're going to show that everything we do is robust to just inferring that everybody in the other category is Jewish. Okay, and so this gives you a sense here of variation in the size of the local Jewish community by type of settlement. So we have different types of settlements in the table. We have urban settlements, we have rural settlements. The rural settlements are drevny and siola, so villages and villages with the church. And then in between, we have mistechki where Mistechka is a local market town, roughly synonymous with the colloquial shtetl. So in the top figure, we see the distribution of share of Jews in these three different types of settlements. And in the bottom figure, we see the distribution of polarization, here defined as the share of Jews times 1 minus the share of Jews. So the second variable, remember, is a non-monotonic transformation of the first. So a settlement with, say, 25% Jews and a settlement with 75% Jews would have the same polarization, but obviously different share of Jews. Okay, and the point here is we see a lot of variation in both measures across all three types of settlements. So even the shtetls, you have shtetls with relatively few Jews and shtetls where the Jewish population is most of the population, and then those in between. Okay, and so this map just shows that even after partialing out province fixed effects and population and settlement type, there's a lot of variation across space and the share of Jews, and then this shows the same thing for polarization. Okay, and then we have other data. So I don't know, you write a paper about some sort of conflict, people expect you to show that it's not being driven by weather shocks. So we have data on temperature and precipitation deviations from the long-term averages for January, April, September, et cetera. We know where railroads are located. This is important in terms of potential diffusion of unrest across space. We know from this paper by Grossfeld and colleagues the number of Jews engaged in various occupations, such as trade and credit. We know where the Bund is located. Generally speaking, it radiates out from Vilnius, which is where it began. And this is, I suppose, potentially important in terms of the ability of Jews to organize in self-defense. And we know when particular settlements or particular provinces, the settlements within those provinces were mobilized during the Russo-Japanese War, which may be important for the sort of mobilization pogroms that we discussed earlier. Okay, so first thing I'm going to show you is not design, these are just correlations for the pre-treatment period. So for the period before the October Manifesto. In that period, just pooling observations for the pre-treatment period, we see that there's really no robust correlation between polarization on the one hand, so that share of Jews times 1 minus the share of Jews, and the incidence of pogroms on the other. So the outcome here is whether or not a pogrom occurred in a settlement in a particular month. We have a handful of settlements where there's more than one pogrom in a given month, and we don't treat those differently than we do where there's only one pogrom. And again, for the pre-treatment period, we see a positive, here we see a positive correlation between the incidence of pogroms and the share of Jews, which, as we've seen, is different from what we observe with the diff and diff. Okay, so our empirical strategy then is difference in differences on a panel of 1,370 Jewish settlements. The outcome is an indicator for whether a pogrom occurred in settlement S in province P. Settlements are nested in provinces at time T in month T, where the treatment interaction, the treatment variable is the interaction between an indicator for the post-October period, and then either polarization defined as Jewish share times 1 minus Jewish share, or just Jewish share. So we do it both ways. So this is with settlement fixed effects, month fixed effects. we're going to allow for differential provincial trends. So we interact indicators for province with the same post-October variables. So we're allowing for the possibility that there's something that happens at the provincial level that's different after the October Manifesto rather than before. We're going to control for various time-varying settlement level characteristics like deviations from long-term trends for temperature and precipitation. We're going to consider interactions of those variables and also of time constant settlement level characteristics like the type of settlement or the population of the settlement, interactions of those variables with the post-October dummy. So we'll allow the effect of all of those variables to differ pre versus post treatment. In some specifications, we'll include the spatial lag of pogroms. So the data aren't really coded finely enough for us to know precisely when many of the pogroms occurred and to be able to say that, well, because this pogrom occurred on November 3rd and this one occurred on November 6th, then maybe the one that occurred on the 6th was a consequence of the one that occurred on the 3rd. We just know they both occurred in November, and but we know whether they're in proximity to each other or not. And so we're going to account for potential diffusion by just including in some models the spatial lag of pogroms, where the spatial weight matrix is just has 0 along the diagonal, and then there's a 1 whenever a settlement is within 50 kilometers of the settlement of observation. So basically, it turns on. We're allowing for diffusion when a settlement is within 50 kilometers of the unit of population, and we'll allow the effect of any spatial lag again to vary pre versus post treatment. And I'll be reporting results with standard errors that correct for both spatial and temporal correlation. Okay, so that's the basic design. Okay, I'm now just going to show you a bunch of results for the next 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll talk a little bit about theory at the end.
Scott, can I just add a quick question?
Yeah, John. Yeah.
More of a comment, but in case you've not seen it, there's a whole bunch, like 2 new papers about these intensity diffs without staggered common shocks.
Yeah.
Which you might want to check out, like it's Callaway, Goodman Bacon, and Pedro Santana.
Yeah.
And they sort of highlight these versions impose some additional assumptions beyond the standard diff because you have, as I imagine you have in your case, like lots of intensities, but almost no cases with 0 intensity for Jewish share or Jewish polarization. So this is sort of like an emerging thing, which is kind of irritating with these different diffs, but it's kind of worth being aware of. Comment on.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, I just decided that we didn't have to worry about any of the new literature in our setting because our treatment wasn't staggered, but of course there's this to worry about. So we need to catch up and take that into consideration. So
the second thing I was just going to say on that was also that it would probably also be nice to show robustness to not including the gamma p by post-October stuff, just because like the type of variation and the weights in the data which you're going to be changing when you do that. So I think it'd be nice to see both versions.
Yeah. So in the tables that I'm going to show you, the first column always does not include that interaction, and then the subsequent columns do. Okay. So we've seen this figure already. So this is change in pogrom incidence in settlements with relatively low and relatively high polarization, defined as Jewish share times 1 minus Jewish share. This is the diff and diff version of that comparison. So the first column here, John, again, does not include the interaction between province fixed effects in the post-October dummy. So we progressively add those interactions. We add time-varying characteristics. We include the spatial lag. We allow for the spatial lag to vary pre versus post October 1905. With respect to polarization, there's just really no evidence of a relationship between that and the change in pogrom incidence pre versus post treatment. And so this is the analogous event study where we interact share of Jews times 1 minus the share of Jews with dummy variables for every period other than the period just other than October 1905. And so what you see is, maybe there's just a hint of a positive relationship between polarization and the change in the incidence of pogroms, but that's not statistically significant. Okay, so that's polarization. So here, in contrast, is share of Jews, and as we've seen, there's a markedly smaller increase in pogroms after the October Manifesto in communities with relatively large Jewish populations. This is the analogous diff and diff estimates. So we do lose some magnitude. I suppose, John, we should check how much of this is from the inclusion of the interactions between province fixed effects and the post treatment dummy, and how much of it is the inclusion of the other variables. We do lose some magnitude as we move from the first specification to the second. And then as we add other things to the model, the results are pretty stable. But in general, a precisely estimated negative relationship between relative size of the local Jewish population and the change in pogrom incidence after publication of the October Manifesto. And so this is, again, the analogous event study. And you see this big negative effect of Jewish share right after publication of the October Manifesto, and then a reversion to baseline or maybe slightly above baseline after November 1905. So all the action is taking place in the month immediately after the October Manifesto. So just keep that in mind. For purposes of presentation, I'll just assume a uniform effect in the post-treatment period going forward, but just understand that really all of this is happening in the period in the month immediately following publication of the October Manifesto.
Scott,
okay.
Just quick question on that. Were you surprised by the bounce back, the quick bounce back?
I guess, but there aren't a lot of pogroms in the period after November, so which isn't to say that it couldn't be either positive or negative in that period. I do think that after this period of 2 or 3 weeks with a lot of pogroms, there was probably a greater sensitivity by local police to the possibility that something could happen. It was just a more difficult atmosphere in general for a pogrom to occur. It could have been that some of the grievances had kind of washed away after the first few weeks. I don't know.
It could also be that the norm of not committing these gets weaker. So that might have expected a slower bounce back. But
I don't think we had really strong priors about what would happen, but it stands out. So you don't see many event studies. You don't see many event studies that look like this, right? Where it's just like one period and then you're back to baseline.
Sorry, just to add to this point, I mean, this kind of strikes me as being perhaps more consistent with the opportunistic coordination device type logic. I mean, I think if the argument is that there's a more permanent shift in the power distribution, then you might expect this to persist going forward unless the pogroms are immediately successful in remedying that power distribution. And perhaps kind of that's what you were just saying, that police get involved and so forth and sort of counteractive, but it's kind of striking, I think, in terms of differentiating those stories.
That's interesting. Yeah. So the coordination opportunity is more transitory. It's like color revolutions happen right after manipulated elections, because that's when the possibility of mobilization becomes focal or something. Yeah. Okay. So this table just shows that if you include both the treatment interaction with the share of Jews and the treatment interaction with polarization in the same model, again, you don't see any robust effect of polarization. The share of Jews, even the magnitude is quite similar to what we see in the regression, where we don't have both of these treatment interactions in the same model. I don't know how many of you have seen this sort of thing before. So we're conditioning on a lot in our model, but you still worry about things that might be changing over time that could be biasing our results. So this is a sensitivity plot of the sort that Chad Hazlitt at UCLA has been working on. So the idea here is to think about how large the effect of some unobserved confounder would have to be to reduce the estimated effect of, in our case, of the treatment interaction by, say, 1/2. So this red dashed locus of points in the northeast corner of the figure is the point at which the effect of treatment would be reduced by 1/2 relative to what we observe in our models. And so in this particular sensitivity analysis, this just says, let's treat both population and the timing of the October Manifesto as exogenous, or more precisely, let's treat the interaction between those two things as exogenous. So if we look at these models, the interaction between log population and the post-October dummy is consistently positive and precisely estimated. So if we assume that that effect is exogenous, then the influence of some unobserved confounder, even 3 times as large as that effect, would not come close to reducing the estimated effect size by 1/2. So there'd have to be a lot of confounding, much stronger really than anything that we observe in the model that we can plausibly think of as exogenous, in order to really sizably bias our results. Nonetheless, there's a lot of other stuff that we worried about. We presented this a few times. Different people have different things that they worry about. So we try to account for diffusion in our empirics through the inclusion of a spatial lag, but you can also think of controlling for diffusion more directly by conditioning on things that might influence diffusion. So in particular, settlements that are located relatively close to provincial capitals, where anti-Semitic organizations are based and where anti-Semitic literature is published. There could be diffusion of grievances or anti-Jewish settlement to a greater degree than for settlements that are located farther from provincial capitals. In similar fashion, settlements that are located relatively close to railroads, you read a lot about pogromists sort of traveling along the rail lines, and they get to the next community and they pick up people there, and there's violence, and then they move on to the next one. So you might think that settlements that are located relatively close to railroads would be more subject to more likely to observe this increase in violence after 1905. And so, indeed, both of these variables work in the direction that these stories suggest, but their effects seem to be really orthogonal to the treatment effect of interest here. So we don't observe any real difference in either the statistical significance or the magnitude of the interaction between share of Jews and the post-October dummy. So you can drop provincial capitals, you see the same sort of relationship. We worry about weather shocks in our baseline models by by conditioning on deviations from long-term temperature and precipitation trends. A different approach would be to actually look at the prices of local agricultural commodities for which we have monthly data during this period, and to interact those with the post-October dummy. And here again, we see similar results. I mentioned that we can impute Jewish share for those cases where we just know that it's a Jewish community as defined by Spitzer, but the Jewish community constitutes less than 10% of the local population. If we assume that that other is all Jewish, increases the sample size somewhat. Very similar results. We can collapse the pre and the post periods, very, very similar estimated magnitudes and significance. Condition on Jewish occupational patterns, a la Grossfeld et al. That doesn't seem to be doing any work. This is interesting. So this is the story. There's this guy, Charters Wynn, who's a historian at UT Austin, who has a book on industrial workers and pogroms in the Donbass during the 1905 Russian Revolution. And his story is that the pogroms are substantially driven by the grievances of industrial workers who had been on general strike and were expecting better working conditions and instead got death to the Tsar. So you might think then that the increase in pogroms would be greater where you have more industrial workers or more industrial output. And from my co-author Dima Kafanov's work and from some other work, Amanda Gregg's work, Amanda's an economic historian at Middlebury, we have data on these things. So, for whatever, maybe we're missing some of the subtlety of the argument, or maybe the argument doesn't hold outside of the Donbass. I don't know, but we don't see evidence of that in our data. John?
Yeah, so one of the things I was thinking about here is, like, can you measure other types of protest or violent events that are not pogroms? It'd be interesting to see, like, whether this is a story of, like, people just becoming more violent and they become violent against a variety of different groups, or whether this is, like, very targeted at Jews, which is sort of most consistent with your story.
Yeah. So in an ideal world, we could do something with peasant unrest, which is something that we've all looked at in previous work. We don't have the sort of fine-grained data on peasant unrest for this period to be able to do that. Factory strikes, I suppose, might be possible. I'd have to think about that. And then just in terms of, like, the street demonstrations that seem to be the precursor to a number of these pogroms, that I'm confident we don't observe. Nobody bothered to write those down. But yeah, we should maybe think about whether we can do something with strikes. Okay. One concern is that maybe there was this earlier wave of pogroms, and so maybe what happened after the earlier wave of pogroms is that Jews moved out of communities where pogroms had occurred to communities that had less latent anti-Semitism. And so what we're observing then is the fact that larger Jewish communities are those to which Jews moved because they were less vulnerable to violence against Jews. So we can account for that directly by just conditioning on whether or not a pogrom occurred in 1881, 1882, and the interaction of that with the treatment dummy, and we don't see any real effect here. And I should say that's probably consistent with Spitzer's account of what happened with Jewish emigration to America after 1881, 1882. That at least it could be different for population mobility within the Pale, but at least with respect to emigration to America, he documents that there isn't any real relationship between whether or not a pogrom had occurred in the home settlement and whether or not people moved to America. There was just kind of a general movement of Jews from the Pale to America after 1881, 1882, but not disproportionately from settlements where a pogrom had actually occurred. Okay. We can condition on presence of the Bund and whether in the interaction of that with post-October, that doesn't matter. Mobilization pogroms, in fact, we do see some relationship here between, so like this story holds up. So there are more pogroms in communities that are settlements that are being mobilized that are being currently mobilized for the Russian military in the Russo-Japanese War. This all takes place primarily in 1904, so during the pre-treatment period. But it doesn't. So it affects, I suppose, the estimates of the pre-trends, but it doesn't have any real influence on the treatment effect of interest. Okay.
Any implications for contemporary politics that we can draw from that?
You could think of if we had a few more minutes, we could. Yeah. I mean, I have thought about that. And how I think many of us in the concerned about Russia community kind of have this model in the back of our heads that mobilization is ultimately going to be Putin's downfall, that the costs of war are going to become so large that this is going to put real pressure on the regime and on the people around Putin. But the experience of Russia suggests that it may express, to the extent that there are such grievances, it may express itself in other directions. So there may be other communities that suffer. And
so bad for the Central Asians in Russia.
That would I think be the analogy. Yeah, the analog today. So yeah. Okay.
Just a clarification. Can you please explain? Can you please explain how you think about the relationship between a higher share of people joining the army and anti-Jewish violence? Like, what kind of mechanisms do you have in mind?
So the mechanism that historians have in mind is that non-Jews are being mobilized into the Russian army. They're upset that they're being mobilized into this war that they understand Jews to be encouraging through their supposed support of the Japanese. And so therefore, through whatever mechanism the grievances result in collective action.
Okay. So it's about grievances. It's not about perception. It's not about heightened perception of power shift.
That's right. I think
people are more pissed off.
That's a different story. I think that's a different story. Yeah. But we just want to be sure that we're accounting for that story and that it's not, that thing which is probably also going on is not biasing our results. So that's the point of that table. So, okay. There's other robustness I could show you, but
just one more.
12 minutes. 12 minutes. I want to be sure we get to the theory. So, but yeah, John.
It's kind of informative for the theory, I think. Is like, can you say anything about how linear this effect is? Like, is it driven by like moving from like 10 to 20% Jews,
Yeah.
or like 70 to
Yeah.
80?
Yeah. No. Somewhere in my appendix slides, I have a slide with quantile, not quantile regressions, but that's something different, but where we just break it out by quintile. So the effect of moving from the lowest quintile to so each of 4 of the 5 quintiles for Jewish share interacted with a post-October dummy, and we see similar effects across the support of Jewish share. Okay. So let's go back to theory a little bit. So try to understand what is going on. So I'm going to I'm going to give you a light presentation of a nice paper by Esteban-Ray in the Journal of Peace Research from 2008, which is based in turn on their Journal of Economic Theory paper from 1999. So this is a model of conflict initiation and intensity. The JET paper shows that conflict intensity is greater when polarization is high. The Journal of Peace Research paper then further shows that conflict initiation is less likely when polarization is high. So in particular, think about a context in which there are 2 groups, say non-Jews and Jews, with some status quo policy, call it gamma, takes a value between 0 and 1, where gamma is the share of some resource, or the weight on some public good that is received by the first group, say by non-Jews, and 1 minus gamma is the status quo distribution received by Jews, by the second group. Okay, so then what Esteban-Ray show is that neither group wants to initiate conflict when their status quo payoff, gamma and 1 minus gamma respectively, is greater than the expected payoff from conflict. So what is that? So if one assumes that the cost of effort of participating in conflict for the member of any group is quadratic, then the probability that the first group, that either group wins, is precisely equal to its population share. So let's let N denote the population share of the first group, say of non-Jews. So the expected payoff then for the first group is monotone increasing in the population share of the first group. So it's equal to its share of winning, probability of winning, which is N times 1 plus N all over 2. And that needs to be lower than the status quo payoff for the first group, for that group to not want to initiate conflict. And similarly, the payoff for the second group, 1 minus gamma under the status quo, needs to be higher than the expected payoff from initiating conflict for the second group, which is this expression on the right. And so in other words, if gamma, which measures the status quo payoffs of the 2 groups, lies in this interval, then neither group wants to initiate conflict. Neither group wants to initiate conflict. Okay, and so if you stare at this interval for a second, you can see that the width of the interval is precisely N times 1 minus N, which is just polarization. So this is the basis for Esteban-Ray's assertion that conflict initiation is less likely when polarization is high. Okay, so what's what are we missing with that story? So implicitly, what Esteban and Ray have in mind is a setting in which you have different polities with idiosyncratic status quo payoffs. And that looking across those polities, we would expect the initiation of conflict to be less likely when polarization is high, because that idiosyncratic status quo payoff is going to be more likely to lie in that interval when polarization is high. But what is political reform? Political reform, like the October Manifesto, is a systematic, not a random shock to the status quo. And as such, it affects groups asymmetrically. So the October Manifesto affects, or at least was perceived to affect, non-Jews differently than Jews. So Jews were systematically disadvantaged under the status quo. The general extension of political and civil liberties under the October Manifesto balances things out. And so we can think of this in terms of the Esteban-Ray model as let's just think of the slightest extension where we extend the model such that the status quo is the sum of two variables, where theta is the systematic, national contribution of the status quo, and epsilon is the idiosyncratic, local contribution of the status quo. So you have communities in which Jews are relatively more or less integrated into local governance structures. That's all in the epsilon term. But the theta moves in response to the October Manifesto. Okay? So with that formulation, then, the group that is disadvantaged by reform, so the group that receives gamma under the status quo, will initiate conflict if theta plus epsilon is less than, again, their expected payoff from initiating conflict, so that the probability of conflict is equal to this term at the bottom over here. And so what political reform does then is it changes theta. So for the group that is disadvantaged by reform, that's receiving gamma under the status quo, theta becomes smaller, and so the probability that that group chooses to initiate conflict becomes larger. Okay? And so in particular, we can think about how that change depends upon the population share of the group that is disadvantaged by reform. So think about a reform that generates some systematic shock to the status quo such that theta is smaller than it was before. Then the differential probability of conflict is increasing in the population share of the group disadvantaged by reform if this expression holds, where all we're doing here is we're just differentiating the expression at the bottom of this previous slide by n, by the population share of the group disadvantaged by reform. Well, so in particular, if the term on the right is equal to 0, in other words, if there was no conflict under the status quo, then this expression holds trivially, and we can say that the differential probability of conflict is increasing in the population share of the group disadvantaged by reform. So in our context, that non-Jews would be more likely to initiate conflict when they are a relatively large share of the local population. And so what is our context? We, in fact, see relatively few pogroms prior to the manifesto. So the status quo in terms of our model. Reform systematically disadvantages monarchists, rightists, other groups threatened by increased civil and political rights, especially for Jews. And so as a consequence, anti-Jewish pogroms are more likely to occur in settlements with relatively small Jewish communities. And so this is all by way of saying that we don't disagree with any of this earlier literature. It's just, as Tim suggested at the beginning, the literature doesn't speak precisely to the question of backlash to political reform, which is something a little different. It's something that is asymmetric, that systematically produces grievances in one group and not another. And what Esteban and Ray would show reading their model properly in terms of our context is that violent backlash to political reform is more likely when the group perceived as advantaged by the reform is small. So we see that what we observe in the data is in fact consistent with existing models properly understood, and that to us is the major or is the chief. I'll let you decide whether it's major or not, but that is the empirical, that is the theoretical contribution of this paper, and that is the end of my presentation. So thanks very much. It looks like we have about 1 minute left if there are any quick questions, and otherwise I know I'm seeing most of you later today.
Any questions, anyone? If not, Carlo.
So is it common to study this type of violence through the lenses of the Esteban-Ray model?
So the empirical work on polarization, which is extensively framed in terms of theoretical work by Esteban-Ray, is cross-national in nature, and it sort of typical exercise is you have some conflict data across countries and over time, and you have some measure of ethno-religious polarization in that country. So sort of think of like, we've all read Frye and Layton, sort of think of like a Frye and Layton sort of exercise. And they show that polarization is positively associated with conflict intensity and negatively associated with incidents. But again, these are very, very diverse settings, and it's not the sort of setting where there's some systematic shock to status quo policy like we observe.
Yeah, so this is not necessarily a criticism of your approach, but perhaps an interesting, useful data point for you. Like my initial reaction to your choice of employing that model is that this is a model in which there is really it's not a model of conflict properly understood. It's a model of aggression. Like in this situation, there is one group that can choose whether or not to attack the other, but the other group really doesn't have in this context the option of doing that. And I wonder whether that matters, whether there are feature of the strategic interaction for which the direct application of the Esteban-Ray model is to be honest, I can't immediately articulate an objection, but I want you to it might be useful for you to know that this is my immediate reaction.
So it's a model of effort in conflict. So so I think it's important that while in our setting, Jews were never in a position to initiate conflict, and certainly would have had no greater incentive to do so after the October Manifesto than before, they do have the ability to fight back. And the incentive to do so depends upon the relative share of Jews and non-Jews in the population in the Esteban-Ray model. And that's what we're picking up with the expected payoff from conflict. So the reason the expected payoff from conflict is not just equal to the share that equal to the probability that a group wins is that it takes into account the costs of conflict as well. And both of those things, the probability of winning and the cost of conflict, depend upon the effort of the of individuals in the two groups. Right, and we do see fighting, and we do see fighting back in this context. It's like, there are communities where local Jewish self-defense organizations set up snipers on the roofs of buildings, and in some cases that seems to have deterred pogroms from breaking out.
Very good, thank you.
Carlo doesn't have an objection, but he wants you to address it anyway. So.
Good. That's my
Thank
job.
you.
So, yeah, good. Yeah, as presenter. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Scott. This has really been terrific, and we really appreciate you coming and speaking to us from your hotel. And so please join me in thanking Scott Gehlbach. We all look forward to seeing this in print.
Look forward to seeing all of you, and it's nice to have seen those of you I've seen already. So thanks so much.
We'll see you soon.
Okay,
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.